So we're on to lecture guide 15, where we're going to go through some of these things very quickly just so I can set up some other works of art. I just want you to know they're out there. And this is a lecture that's on French academicism, meaning the continuation of neoclassical ideas in the French Royal Academy. Something known as naturalism, which are movements that try to move away from the idealism of the Academy and show oftentimes everyday scenes, or scenes from, let's say, classical subjects, but in a more natural rather than ideal way, onto realism, which are works of art, and when I get to this, I'll go into it in more detail, that are meant to change the way that social relations occur in the world. They're meant to be political weapons to agitate for change. So what you've got up in front of you is Carpo's The Dance. This is just a throwaway work. I just want you to see what happens to the French Academy, or one of the big changes. Naturalism, in the case of Carpo and The Dance, are just making these bodies look more realistic. They look more like real bodies rather than idealized bodies. They're not. This is a work, by the way, that was created to exist right outside of the Paris Opera House to invite people into this beautiful venue. And I show you this because you can probably tell they look a little bit more, natural, a little bit more real. But for the people of the time, these were so much more real. They didn't look idealized to them that they found these things too erotic. Suddenly, because they were no longer idealized, perfect bodies, that they looked kind of like, really nice everyday bodies, people went, this isn't something that's a legitimate subject to be showing in public. These men and these women, this figure of the dance with all of these nymphs around him, it seemed like some kind of sexual romp, and they got very critical about it. They were okay with things like this, though, and it's one of the reasons I put them together. This is a work by William Adolph Boogero, a French artist. I would be shocked if you haven't seen his work. He was very prolific. He had a huge workshop. He's an incredibly gifted painter. I mean, he can paint the heck out of anything. Beautiful, photorealistic looking works, but of course they're not realistic at all. They're all idealized. This one's called Nymphs and Seder. And again, it's almost the same subject of what you've just seen before, but everything's idealized. And the public was okay with this because, remember, the idealized female form was supposed to be understood as beautiful with a capital B. Beauty was something that lifted your mind into contemplation of truth and goodness and God and so forth, going all the way back to the Renaissance where we started. And they'll accept this even if the subject matter itself is a little bit, weird, frankly. In case you don't know, satyrs, half men, half goat, are absolutely symbolic of the animal passions of humankind for the Greeks. All a satyr is up to, frankly, half the time is trying to get drunk, playing music and hunting for various ladies. And he doesn't care. He's indiscriminate about these types of things. So to see this work in which you have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, what I take to be really very good-looking women, all idealized. They're all nymphs, by the way, which, by the way, is where we get the term nymphomaniac, so they're down with whatever, dragging him into the water, which we already know is symbolic of sex, right? The bath of Venus, and he's like, no, I shouldn't do this, is kind of unbelievable, right? What is this work? How does it... Remember how classical works almost always have some kind of moral message to them? The moral message here is actually chastity, being taught to us by a satyr, which I find completely unconvincing. In other words, it's not really about that. It's about this, right? Can we all grant that's a nice butt? That's why people are buying this. Or this. Again, you should know this stuff inside and out. I shouldn't have to say much about it. This is a Birth of Venus scene. The first way that this is accepted in the Academy is to say, that is beautiful. Beauty is a manifestation of the divine. The divine comes along with truth. It comes along with goodness. That's why we create these things. And it's a gorgeous female form. But it is also, in addition to that, all of the other things that we talked about. It's a way to objectify women. It's a way for us to think about women as only being really valuable for their appearances. It's a way for us to be put into a position of power, the position of the voyeur vis-a-vis a figure who doesn't look at us in return. It's a way for us to basically claim, and by us I mean heterosexual men, our own desire on our own terms without anything creating any anxiety about the possibility that these women won't want us back. I mean, this gets so popular. All of those female nudes that you know everything about, you see them in every museum in the world, they are really primarily the 19th century's phenomenon. Right? You do have things before it. We've seen it in this class, but the proliferation of these images is a product of the French Royal Academy in the 19th century and a bourgeoisie, meaning a middle class, that wants to buy works of art that somehow partake of the qualities of ancient classical works of art that are totally buyable and that, are sexually titillating. This is another one of those what I call double articulations. It says two things at once that complement each other in the sense that one authorizes the other, but on another level they seem completely contradictory. This one's called Youth Defending Herself Against Eros. Eros being love. Cupid, of course, over here, is trying to poke her with his arrow. This will inflame her lust. And she's fighting him off. No, I can't. I need to remain chaste. Does anyone think this is a good way to teach young women to be chaste? Can you imagine talking to your children or having your mom come and talk to you and be like, hey, you need to watch out for the men. Why don't you just make sure that you don't have sex? Let me show you this picture. Does this make sense to anyone? No, it's not really about that, is it? It says don't do that. But how many of the men in this class are rooting for Cupid at this stage, right? Same thing here. Again, youth and Eros. He's trying to talk her into something. She's supposedly saying, no, I can't. It's not right. I need to remain chaste. That's what's good and true and beautiful and so forth. But really, a nude woman, is what we're painting this picture for. And that's why people are buying it. It's not about the moralizing lesson that authorizes that figure of the nude woman. Just to set you up for something that's coming up next lecture too, in 1863, the most famous, most talked about painting of this very important year was this work by Alexander Cabanel called The Birth of Venus. And it's a beautiful representation of the female form again, an idealized Venus now not standing up but being pushed into shore on this wave. It's got all of the features of everything we've talked about before, right? Idealized female form, emphasis on all the things that were seen as very sexy at the time, right? One breast in profile, one full frontal, long, beautiful hair, idealized body. They loved big hips, so you look at this hip, it's like kabam, it even bumps the pootie up in the air here, right? And then it's also got this kind of voyeuristic quality to it, where she's just waking up, so her hand over her eyes, if you look at it really closely, those eyes are just opening. She sees you in a way, but does anyone feel like she's going to wake up and be like, dude, why are you looking at me? Not at all, right? It's just almost this feeling of she's peeking to look at you to see, are you checking me out? Because I look good. I just want to make sure that you see that I look good here. Voyeurism, right? Those are the money makers for the classical artists, the Academy artists, artists associated with the French Royal Academy, which by this time is called the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of the Beautiful Arts, which is still around today. They would create those, they'd show those in the salon, and then they'd sell those out of the various galleries that had popped up all over Paris at the time. But they would also want to create works of art that would make them historically important as well, and these are more ambitious works. These are the works that are part of that tradition of history painting again. So this is a work by Jean-Léon Gérôme called The Death of Caesar. And I could have picked any number of artists, but Jean-Léon Gérôme is a very popular artist of this time. Most of his works are female nudes. Most of his works are actually orientalizing pictures. But every other year he would paint one ambitious history painting, so as to say, I'm a serious painter too. I don't just, I guess what I'm saying is these artists knew that the female nude was a little bit of fluff, right? This is a way to sell paintings. This is a way to get people interested in your work. But they knew historically the works that were going to make them famous had to be history paintings. So he picks again, an ancient Roman subject, the death of Caesar. Everyone's heard about this one. Julius Caesar gets too big for his britches. The Senate conspire to assassinate him. They all do it together. And here he is laying crumpled on the floor while they march out into the streets to proclaim that Caesar is dead. He's done some things that by this time become standard. The theater here in which this is taking place is not actually in Rome. Remember that Herculaneum in Pompeii had just been rediscovered about 100 years before this and systematically excavated. The space is based upon a study of the theater in Pompeii. So that archaeological accuracy that first showed up in the grand manner is now being adopted by the French here. It's not a romantic painting in the sense that if a romantic painter was showing this, you'd probably see about a bunch of people stabbing Caesar and blood flying everywhere. Here what we have is the aftermath. This figure contemplating the act, right? What he made all his money on, though, were these types of paintings. And he actually married a woman who was connected. Her father and her entire father's family were engravers, printmakers, so that he could turn his paintings into engraving and make even more money that way as well. This is a work that's called The Slave Market. And it's somewhere, again, in that mystical Orient. In this case, I presume we're trying to think about North Africa, but who the heck knows, right? And it sets up women, and we've seen this before with Hiram Power's Greek slave, as objects to be bought and sold. And this authorizes the very thing, the very kind of fantasies that people are buying this for, in my opinion. You're not buying this to be taught that it's not okay to traffic in women. Everyone already knows this. You don't need a painting for that. And you certainly don't need a painting like this with a docile woman who, by the way, if you're wondering what this guy's doing, he's checking to see if she has good teeth, which gives you that added charge of being able to imagine your fingers going into her mouth, as well as whatever other fantasies are going on here. In other words, you're saying something like, oh, those Orientals, or oh, those North Africans, which, by the way, it should be mentioned if I haven't already, that Western Europe is colonizing all of these places at this time, are inferior to us, right? They treat their women in these horrible ways. I can't believe that. Well, of course, people are buying this so that they can look at that beautiful body and imagine various fantasies about it, I presume. Another work by Jerome, thumbs down, gladiatorial scenes, right? More of a kind of history painting, but also charged with all of the atmosphere of Romanticism. Everyone knows about the gladiatorial games, very bloody affair, the major form of entertainment for the Romans. This is that moment in time where after someone has been kind of succumbed by another, one might ask the crowd whether you save them or not, with a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And you see the thumbs down happening here. Another thing's going on too, and this is a part of your reading that's worth mentioning. By the middle of the 19th century, with the proliferation of the female nude and a whole host of questions, frankly, in society that we haven't gotten to about, whether those nudes really are about beauty, people started to wonder about artists' relationships to their models. After all, the live models for artists oftentimes came from the lower classes. Sometimes they were immigrants. They were certainly people that were deemed questionable by, let's say, upstanding society. And of course, if you start thinking, just stick with me here, if you start thinking something like, let's go back to this one. There's a woman that posed as the model for this, right? Now, probably didn't look exactly like this. It's obviously been idealized, but there are women going to artist studio, laying down in these poses, right? Being very provocative. We know that artists are a little bit shady anyway, frankly. What if all those rumors about artists having affairs with their models is true? Do we want to admit that in our society? That would, after all, make people start thinking about those female nudes in a different way, wouldn't it, if you knew the artists are sleeping with all their models, which, by the way, many of them were. And so you get a ton of paintings that are like this. This is Jean-Léon Gérôme's work called The Artist in His Studio. in which the artist goes out of their way to show the process of creation in a really dignified, completely asexual way. And one of the reasons to know this is that in about 50 years, when modern artists start representing this, they go the total other way. They just start showing their desire for their models all over the place. In this case, what I mean by that is, you've got the model here. She's without clothes, but the artist himself seems like he's not, and we're not even sure he's looking at her. He seems to be looking at his own sculpture, which he is showing you why he needs that nude in the first place. He's nipping and tucking, he's elongating, he's firming up various areas and so forth. He's idealizing from the naturalized form. He is old, he's not young and lustful. He's even wearing gloves so that you don't get any of this touchy-feeliness. In other words, this is a work that, at least in part, is not just about how creation occurs. It's keeping in mind the idea that, oh, people are worried about our relations with our models. Let me make sure that I kind of quash any of that innuendo in my representation of this. In fact, in the background, you have a scene of Pygmalion and Galatea. This is another painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme that is on the subject. And by the way, again, in Greek mythology, these stories are told a million different ways. But in the basics of this story, a sculptor is inspired by Venus or Aphrodite to create a beautiful sculpture, Pygmalion. He falls in love with her. He's so in love with her that Aphrodite takes pity on him and turns her live. But in many of the stories, she only turns him, the model live, or the sculpture live, from the waist up, so that it's a kind of platonic love rather than any kind of sexual love. And you can see that here even. She gets kind of color up here, but down below she's still all, of course, marble. That's to take out of the equation any idea of sexuality in this love. It's love for beauty. At the exact same time that this is occurring, in the French Academy, at a much lower level in the hierarchy of what's considered great art, landscape painting starts to take off as well. And the landscape painters in the 19th century in France, the big group that people are aware of, is something known as the Barbazon School. The Barbazon School is, again, just like the Hudson River School, not a school at all. It's a number of artists who are working out of the forest of Fontainebleau in the area known as Barbazon. It's a little artist colony. It's a place that Parisians go on weekends to escape the big city and get back to the country and buy paintings on their way out of town. So in this case, you're looking at Camille Corot's work called Morning Dance of the Nymphs as an example of the Barbazon School. Corot was one of the most famous of these Barbazon School painters. These works are kind of antidotes to big city life. They're a beck and call back to a simpler, more pastoral life for people who are working in the big and newly renovated city, right? So they want these things to hang on their walls in the city to remind them of what's no longer around them. It's just, again, an Arcadian scene, something that is meant to be, pleasing to our eye, and also something that kind of gets you this fantasy of living, I guess, in the forest with nymphs, or, living the simple life. This kind of work, too, by Rosa Bonner, who's a very interesting artist, a woman artist who we don't get to cover much in this class, is another form of what was known as naturalism. Paintings that show lower class, paintings that show landscapes, paintings that show everyday work, and extol the virtues of the hard work of the lower classes in particular. This one is called The Plowing in the Nineveh, Dressing of the Vines. It's a kind of long title that's meant to say they're plowing the fields, getting ready to plant, for the crop. It was a work that, by the way, was commissioned by the French Grand Assembly. So the state of France actually asked for this work to be created. The Nineveh are a little bit like the Skagit River Valley or something. It's a very fertile part of France. This work, in other words, is meant to be an analogy for the fertility of France, both in terms of agriculture, but also in terms of the idea that France can produce. France has potential. In this case, it's naturalistic because the people who are working here aren't the owners. They're the people that are working the fields. In fact, the big heroes of this seem to be the oxen, who are shot from way down below in this accelerated perspective to make them look even bigger and grander than they actually would be. The other hero, of course, is this rich, loamy soil that is symbolic of the fertility of France. My major example, though, of naturalism will be this painter, Francois Millet. It looks like millet, but the French pronounce it Millet. And this one's called The Sower. Francois Millet, like most of these naturalist painters, actually lived in Paris. These are scenes that are not painted for lower class people. They're painted for the middle class or even upper class. Naturalism, I want to have you think about, at least in this class, as something that is quite different than realism, in the sense that what naturalism does is it takes something that in real life would be very, very difficult to do, especially year after year, generation after generation, which is it takes the lower class, basically working lower class, almost peasant population who is sowing his field, and it extols the virtues of hard work rather than what a realist painter would do, which is to say, this isn't fair that certain people have no social mobility, are forced into this way of life, that we don't take care of them. In other words, a naturalistic painting is something that oftentimes you'll see, frankly, if you've ever seen the covers of National Geographic or something, or frankly a lot of, I think of this as kind of documentary photography, in which you'll see a lower class homeless person, but you look at it and instead of thinking, wow, that is the worst possible life I can imagine, you say, wow, what an interesting face. What a quirky picture. What a difficult life that this person is enduring. In other words, naturalism like this shows you this guy in ruddy clothing out doing a pretty difficult job. There's no way he's going to work his way up the ladder and, in a few years own the property. That's just not a possibility. He's tossing the seeds out, as Millet put it, his mouth is open because he's whistling the day away. And just as soon as he throws these seeds out, which by the way are money, the crows are swooping in behind him to eat them up, and he doesn't have a care in the world. I don't know if you ever were unfortunate enough to have to watch that horrible show that was of my youth. My parents didn't allow us to watch very much television, but for some reason they thought that it was a wholesome show to make us watch this show called Little House on the Prairie. And if you haven't had the misfortune to have to see this before, I want you to look it up just so you have some sympathy for my childhood. But in that show, it's a lower class family living on a farm, working really hard day after day. They're very religious. These are all parts of this kind of naturalism. And every single episode, some catastrophe hits them, right? Week number 1, it's a flood. It washes out the entire crop. Doesn't matter that bankrupt them. Pa is going to set back to work and set it aright, and they all pray to God and everything's good. Next week it's locusts. The week after that it's a fire. Next week it's a herd of buffalo. Who the hell knows? Every week it's something, and they're still like, it's all good. We're just going to keep, whatever. That's what naturalism is like. This life sucks. I mean, anyone else would have been like, I'm out, right? Pa, get in the train. We're going somewhere where locusts aren't, right? No. Go back to it every day. And that's this kind of work. Another example, the Angelus, or Angelus. The Angelus is actually a religious observance. It's something that happens in different ways in different parts of the world. In France at this time, it takes place 5 times a day. The church bells ring, and you stop to pay your respect to your God. You stop to pay your thanks, right? So here you have, again, lower class farming family, probably at twilight. They've been working all day, pausing at the end of another very hard day, and it will be generation after generation doing this with no possibility of social mobility, to pay their respects to God. This type of painting, you probably notice it is very tonal, right? It's all just atmospheric. It feels like, somber in some way, but it's also meant to romanticize. It's also meant to say, Look at how hard they work, how religious they are, how thankful they are for even the simple things. What it doesn't do is what a realist would do, is say, this isn't fair, right? It's great that these people are working this way, but they should have the option to do something else. We should make it easier for them. The most famous of Francois Millet's works is this work called The Gleaners, and it's a very good example of naturalism. In this case, you really do literally have the lowest of the low. Gleaning, for those of you who don't know, is a practice, a kind of charitable practice that goes all the way back in time. It's documented in the Old Testament. What occurs here is that after the harvest of grains in particular, the lowest of the low, the peasant populations, are allowed to come back over the area that has already been harvested and glean, meaning pick up whatever's left over to make their own bread. Again, it's a form of charity. And in this case, you have the lowest of the low, meaning women peasants gleaning. At this time in France, gleaning was actually being put out of business, so to speak. Farms kept getting bigger. Bigger farms were like, we don't want people running around our farms. Gleaning was being pushed out. So it's not even accurate that this kind of charity occurred that often anymore. And here they are, back-breaking work, picking up whatever's left over. And what we're supposed to do, and the way that he shot this is way down low, looking up high, they look very heroic, is say, wow, look at them endure the hardships of their life. Good for them. It doesn't make us think, this is bullshit, right? How do we create a world in which people aren't forced to do this generation after generation? How do we create access to wealth, to education, to other possibilities? Which is what realism will try to do. Now, one of Courbet's most famous realist works is one that you might think on the surface doesn't seem particularly political. We're now into realism, which are works of art that are meant to change the status quo. They're meant to make you angry about social inequities. They're influenced by some major things going on at the time in the realm of politics. This is a work from 1848. It's actually shown in the French Royal Academy. It's called A Burial at Ornans by Gustave Courbet. In 1848, does that year spark a memory for anyone? Something famous is published in 1848. Communist Manifesto. And for those of you who only know communism through, let's say, China or through the USSR or something like that, communism in the 19th century was a kind of utopian political possibility. It hadn't been, let's say, corrupted by authoritarianism. It was the idea that this would create equity between all members of society. All members of society would do their part, and all would partake in the profits of that work. And while it had a bunch of hitches to it, as everything does, as we know democracy does today as well, people thought this is a way to get equity into the world. And they started talking about these ideas. Even if they didn't buy into communism directly, they believed that the world was inequitable. Especially in France here. Remember, they went through the French Revolution, failed, put in a new monarch checked by Parliament, failed, put in another one, and we've just come up to another switch. In 1848 in France, Louis Philippe, the guy who got put into place for the monarch who put that ship's captain in for the raft of the Medusa, he got ousted in a popular kind of revolt / vote. And the person who gets put into power is Louis Napoleon. Now, this isn't going to work either, because Louis Napoleon, who's a populist, within a couple of years, will, in a coup d'etat, take over France, proclaim the Second Empire, and proclaim himself Napoleon III. But in any case, right at this moment, people are actually talking about the possibility of changing French society to a more equitable, socialized society. So in this work, which is the least political of the ones that I'll show you, here you've got something that is meant to take on French academic painting. And it starts from the premise that academic classical paintings of the French Royal Academy are by their very nature conservative, which they are. They absolutely are. They're meant to say there are these golden ages, you have to conserve those ideas, all of those values associated with those golden ages can't be assailed, they're all perfect, which of course we know not to be true. So what he does here, in other words, is he takes on the classical tradition by creating a work of art that basically breaks every rule of classicism you can imagine, so as to say we need an alternative form of painting that can do something else, that can be more equal, more democratic. So here's my question to you. In a burial at Ornon, if you were to say, if the question on the final was something like, what are all of the ways that this painting breaks a fundamental rule of classical art, as you have learned it going back to the Renaissance, as you heard it again going at Poussin and his rules, as we've talked about over and over again, let's hear what that list is. So turn to your neighbors, look at this painting, start with the subject matter, then go on to all the ways that the subject matter is represented. What rules of classical art is this painting? And it's supposed to be doing this, breaking. By the way, the painting is huge. It's 22 plus feet across. It's a massive work. So let me prompt you and then you tell me what you think. Let's start with the subject matter. Why couldn't this subject possibly be a good classical subject? Yeah. There's nothing grand about it. It's a burial at Ornon. Does anyone know where Ornon is? Anyone know whose burial it is? It's probably Courbet's maternal grandfather's burial. It's his hometown. There's nothing special about this. In other words, it's not the burial of Jesus. It's not the burial of Napoleon. Not the burial of some ancient Roman leader. It's not grand. It's everyday. But do you see why Courbet would do that? Every person's burial should be important. Every death should matter. We shouldn't just, as painters, care about exceptional people. I mean, how many of you took history and had a really crappy history teacher who was like, and then so-and-so came to power, and then he died, and then so-and-so came to power, and then there was a war, and then so-and-so, and you're like, wait a minute, what actually happened in the world besides these names? That's Courbet. Why don't we care about these things? What else isn't classical about this? What do you expect from classicism? Let's just go through the rules. Grand subject, that's gone. What else? Oh, you're not going to do very well on your finals. Yep.
Nothing's really idealized.
We don't have anything idealized, especially let's start with those bodies. Any canons of proportions there? Any nude heroic figures? Any idealized faces? Perfect symmetry, proportionality? No. If you get up close on these figures, right? Everyday folk. Every single one of them. Not idealized. Everyday people. Let's go back to this again. You expect to find a focal point in a classical painting. Anyone find the focal point yet? You got about 15 of them. You're like bing, 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 just milling around there. You want to know why? Because everyday scenes don't have focal points. Come up here and stand where I am and say, what's the focal point of this classroom? There's not one. There's a bunch of individual people out there milling around. In fact, he went out of his way to try to create what he called an anti-composition. No hierarchy in his composition of this is most important, and then that's most important, and then that's most important. And the rationale for this is when you do that, when you have this hierarchy of importance that you tell people as a painter, this is more important than that, and that's more important than that, you get that same hierarchy showing up in society, where everyone thinks this is better than that, that person's better than that. Don't pay attention to those people. So in this case, you do have some things that are points of emphasis, right? So you'll look at these guys that are in red. Who are they? Well, they're beadles. Beadles, B-E-A-D-L-E-S. They're church administrative officials. Their job is basically to look after the parish and to collect money and send it back to the central church and so forth. Do they look like they want to be at this burial? They look bored to tears, don't they? I just want to go anywhere else. You also have other points of emphasis. This crucifix sitting up here. And by the way, it's hard to tell, but that crucifix is actually attached to this pole here, and you're thinking, religiosity. Maybe. And then you get over here and you're like, big hole in the ground. Okay, the grave. Then you see these figures. In real life, you'd be able to pick this out better. They're a little bit more illuminated, and they're dressed in clothing that's not the same clothing as everyone else there. That again, someone with extra time in their hands was able to say, why do they look a little different? That clothing is actually clothing people wore during the original French Revolution of 1789. These are older men, and the presumption is, the symbolism is, the man who just died is of their generation, the generation of the first French Revolution, and the ideas that were so espoused by that generation might be dying off with them. We need to reinvigorate them. The bottom line is you can keep going through everything. You see any clear distinction between foreground, middle ground, background, any symmetry, any balance, any use of central point perspective? I mean, just work your way through every rule of classicism and you're going to be disappointed by this work. And it's all done, as I said before, because he believes that classical works of art actually instill the types of values in society that he wants to critique. One thing being better than other things. That the world as it exists, with certain people having and other people not having, should be the case. Classicism actually, he believes, implicitly supports that idea. An easier work to get to when it gets to his politics is a work like this. So again, I'm going to turn this over to you. This is a work that actually, unfortunately, was destroyed in World War II. It's of the same year, 1848. It was also exhibited in the French Royal Academy of that year. It's called The Stonebreakers. And what you're looking at is like the world's worst job as far as I can think of. If you've had a crappy summer job and you're heading towards another one this summer, just comfort yourself in knowing that this isn't your job. Their job is to make gravel by hand, hitting rocks with a hammer all day. I don't know if you've used a hammer all day just in general, but can you imagine hitting a rock with a hammer over and over again? And they're going to be doing this the rest of their life, is the idea. So here's the question. If this is a romantic work, right? Meaning it is meant to emphasize that this is not fair, that this is not okay, that it wants you to feel like that so that you'll go change the world versus naturalistic works. They're like, isn't that life hard, but shouldn't we glorify these people? How is this different? How does this emphasize that unfairness, this tragedy of lives spent in abject poverty, doing really difficult, back-breaking labor generation after generation? Turn to your neighbors, looking at the visuals of this work of art, just think, what emphasizes how difficult this is? Okay, so someone just give me one thing you notice here that's emphasizing again how difficult this is. Yep.
Their clothes suck.
Okay, their clothes suck. They're all falling off of them. They're worn out. Every single part of them. Rags, right? What else? Yep. Neither of their faces are showing. What do you make of that? I mean, there's multiple different ways. Dylan, yeah? Not important enough to have a face, maybe. Not important enough to pay attention to. It's a little bit like, you know, when you see a homeless person, you've seen like 5 and they're going to accost you and you just like look the other way. Not worth representing. Another possibility to think about this is they're anonymous because this could be anyone. Could be any number of people in this role. I don't want to show you an individual face because you might think, oh, it's Bob and Bob's friend. No. Could be anyone in this role. What else do you notice? Yeah?
The guy on the ground seems a little older, so it kind of seems like a father and son role, and like the son will be subjected to this, like after his father dies, that'll just be him and his son.
Excellent. So if you didn't hear that, this is a kind of generational thing. Whether they're father and son, they're definitely of 2 different periods of life. The older man, the younger man. And one gets the feeling that the younger man will at one point be the older man. And there will be another younger man taking that place, and generations after generations will march through this, horrible life, not having any possibility for change, working menial labor without any possibility, again, of social mobility, year after year, generation after generation. What else? Everyone notice the colors here? Any of those colors seem joyous to you, pleasing? Is there a hint of green anywhere? Does it look just like a blasted, hot landscape? Absolutely. Do you feel all of the shadows kind of crawling down, descending this hill? Remember what I said about descending lines, descending shapes. Things coming down instead of going up are going to be depressive. This feels pretty darn depressive to me. In fact, the one glimmer, the one opening, like the escape hatch, so to speak, is tiny. And yet it's there. It's as if Courbet is saying something like, there is a glimmer of hope if you want to open up that window for them. And what points to it? Here's this shovel, and it just points us up there, Like, how do you get out of this? Well, they're not going to do it on their own. Something's going to have to change this. And there's something else going on here. The work that they're doing, making gravel, could have been for a number of things, but 2 big prominent possibilities are, number one, the railways are going crazy in France and the United States at this time. They're laying track everywhere, and they need gravel as the basis of the trusses and so forth. The other one is that Paris is in the midst of the first glimmers of its renovation, which will happen much more thoroughly in the next few years. But they're putting in these grand boulevards, and they need the gravel. They need to lay those roads. In other words, what I'm getting at is that, and by the way, in France, railways are very closely associated with the French state. The state itself, the government itself, has a vested interest in cheap labor. They don't want to change this. How are they going to pay for these things if they don't have people that can work cheaply to do them? Now, there's some other things that you might not have picked up on, but here's a guy who knows his business. He's been doing this so long that he's fashioned a pillow out of grass off to the side, right? Over here is a lunch pail, literally. That's the one thing he has to look forward to all day. Everything else is going to suck, but I can't wait to have my lunch. In 1855, again, just briefly, you don't need to remember this work, but I want you to know what happens. In 1855, there is a kind of coalescence of 2 big factors. The French Royal Academy's big salon or exhibition is supposed to take place in that year, and Paris wants to put on a universal exposition, which are basically the first of the world's fairs. They're going to take place on the same year, so this is going to be a big year for painters. In other words, this is do your best work because everyone's going to come to see this thing. Courbet does this work called A Studio of a Painter, a real allegory summarizing my 7 years as an artist, right? Don't bother. I'm not going to put it on the final promise. In any case, the reason that I find this so important is that it is a manifesto of realism, and he created it hoping that it would go in the French exhibition, the big academic exhibition, alongside the other two works that you've just seen, plus about 3 others. He had enough of a name for himself because he got a lot of popular support from people who were socialist-leaning, that he thought he could basically bully the French Academy into showing these works, and they said, no, we already showed a bunch of them, wall spaces at a premium, we're not showing them again, we'll show this work but not the other ones. He got pretty grumpy about this, and he put on his own exhibition to realist painting, which by the way was just his paintings, with the help of his major collector right outside the major exhibition. The reason I bring this up is this is the first really alternative exhibition to the arts besides the French Royal Academy at this time. And it's hard to imagine what it would be like if you're a painter working in a type or style or genre of painting that the French Royal Academy doesn't support, and how difficult that would be. You didn't have another place to show your work, and if you couldn't show your work, how are you going to sell your work? One of the big things that changes, of course, right around the same time period that this class ends is you start to get alternative exhibition spaces for the arts. But at this point, he only has this one. It also allows me, though, to talk about how when you have new modern styles that aren't part of the old traditions, you need a whole lot of infrastructure to support you. And over here is that infrastructure. Here's Courbet. He's painting a landscape scene. He wants to tell you he's a realist, so he paints a female nude in here, but it's a very, very realistic or naturalistic nude. It looks like a real woman rather than an idealized woman. And then over here, what he called his stockholders or shareholders. This is Charles Baudelaire, the famous author and art critic, right? Very well-known quantity, someone who told everyone all artists should represent their own day and age, the age in which they're alive. And here he is, a supporter of Courbet. These are collectors that collected his work. The major collector is this guy here, Alfred Bruyas, who had tons of money to support Courbet's work. Another critic over here, and young art collectors over here playfully put in as what he called the art lovers, kissing off in the corner. Over here are the subjects of his art, everyday people. Courbet also went after the academic tradition and some of its hypocrisies by showing you that, of course, all those stories that you see in French paintings that are saying, oh, it's only those other, Orientals, the other cultures that treat their women as sexual objects, isn't really accurate at all. This one's called Young Women on the Banks of the Seine. The Seine is the major river that goes through Paris, and what you're basically looking at are French prostitutes. And they're not glamorized, they're not idealized, they're not Ingres odalisque, right? And yet what he's showing you is prostitution, of course, occurs in Paris. Tons of young women flocked to Paris in the middle of the century looking for another life. And when they got there, they realized there were very few venues that they could gain employment. And over the course of months, many of them turned towards prostitution. These are 2 of them. And again, the context of this isn't just, hey, we've got prostitutes around. The context of this is Courbet saying, you know that Orientalist tradition that says only those others are the ones who are bad guys or treat their women poorly? Not true at all. Here's a case where you could just go under any bridge or off to the banks of the Seine under a tree and find prostitutes at any moment. And you all know that. Anyone in Paris knows that. He also, too, basically created works of art that were meant to be erotic. Meant to be erotic. Not saying, oh, these are just idealized forms that are meant to be beautiful, but literally erotic. Such as works like this, called, ridiculously, by the way, titled The Sleepers. Do they look like they're sleeping to you? I don't know any type of narrative that would make this make sense, right? It's kind of like those first reclining female nudes. It's supposed to be an erotic fantasy for men, and he's selling it as such. Let me pause here for just a minute. So I'm going to jump forward here to Honoré Daumier's work. Daumier is another realist who worked primarily in prints. This is a lithograph. Lithograph prints are pretty easy to produce. He worked in prints, of course, because he has a social purpose to his works of art. And he believed that prints, of course, can reach a wider audience than paintings can. And he's absolutely right there. This is an easy one. It's a little bit like, and most of his works were a little bit like political cartoons, just really well done ones. It's called Gargantua. And the figure that you have here, who is Gargantua, that giant figure sitting in his chair, is Louis Philippe. This is the man who was put into power after that monarch was deposed that was, at the base of that tragedy of the raft of the Medusa. He'll be in power all the way to 1848. Daumier, like most people, think that this guy is just in it for him and his friends to get fatter, richer, make more money. And it's pretty literal. In this case, all the peasant populations, even middle-class people who have dropped out of the middle class, are bringing all their taxes, putting in these bushels that are being carted up by these men in tails. They're all associated with the legislative bodies that are supposed to check his power, to feed Louis Philippe, to feed the French state. If we were in contemporary politics, you'd say this is kind of like a Tea Party emblem. Big state, not good. Big government, not good. We just pay these taxes, and what do we get from it? Well, you get it here. He's literally crapping out legislation, right? These guys are like, it's the latest great thing. Running off to the Pantheon in the background to proclaim this as the latest great thing. Louis Philippe, by the way, is purposefully made into a particular shape. He's supposed to look like a pear. And that's because in French, this visual pun, pear, the French term for pear is poire, and poire is a slang term for a moron. So it's saying this moron is just getting fat off of all of your taxes, and all you get is this bullshit legislation. I mean, literally, it says that. And he's doing this at a time in which the freedom of the press is a quaint idea. He actually went to prison for 6 months for creating this work of art. Then he came right back out and said, here are some of the problems in our society. I'm going to use art to highlight them. I'm a realist. This is a work that's called Rue Transnonaine. Rue Transnonaine just means street Transnonaine. It's a place in an industrial town in France in which there's an uprising. There was basically a group of textile workers who were agitating for what we would think of today as organized labor. And if you don't know yet, early moments in which organized labor was attempted were oftentimes quelled by very, very brutal, in very, very brutal ways, oftentimes by the state. In this case, same thing occurred. These textile workers tried to organize. The gendarmes were sent down to quell that possibility. People threw trash out of their windows at the gendarmes as they marched down the street, and they rushed into a high-rise tenement building and indiscriminately started shooting people, including killing off 3 generations of a family, which you see here. The father and his wife, their child, and the grandfather here. And again, because the French state controlled most of the press, these ideas didn't get out except in secondary newspapers such as the one that he worked for, Caricature, and he thought, like so many people did at the time, that art could be a social weapon, that could draw people's attention to something that maybe words couldn't. And by the way, we're talking about middle of the 19th century, so even though photography is around, photography was not a viable way to communicate ideas in newspapers because you couldn't print it directly at that stage. Or simple one-liners. You've seen this guy before. That's a beetle again, right? Church administrator. Here's a fat cat legislator, and they're showing up to check on a political prisoner, someone who's gotten in trouble with, probably rebelling against the political situation. And the title of this one's called It's Safe to Release This One. And the reason it's safe is he's dead now. The final work that I want you to be aware of for Daumier is this work, final realist work. And I'm just going to go over this briefly. This is called Third Class Carriage. Third class carriage just is like you got a first class, you got second class, third is the lowest class carriage. It refers to these giant carriages, horse-drawn, kind of the earliest form of transport, that would take people in and out of the burgeoning metropolis of Paris at the time. And of course, what it does is it sticks you in the lower class carriage so that you can see the plight of the lower classes, which you might not know about. Remember, Daumier's painting this for the middle classes. In this close-up of the people you're sitting in this space with, you realize they're old and tired and don't even have the energy, as do the people behind them, to converse. And then you start thinking, wait a minute, why is that woman taking her baby into work? And the answer is, what's her alternative? She can't afford childcare. And where's that boy going? He's not going off to school. Child labor laws, when they were ever passed, were never enforced. He's going to go work to help that family survive. One of the reasons they're so tired, by the way, and this would have been accompanied by, in the printing of this type of factual information, was that they worked on average, 12-hour days, 6 days a week, that their average daily commute, because they couldn't afford to live in Paris anymore, Paris had been renovated and basically gentrified, was on average about 4 hours of commute time. Right? So think about that. Just add it up. You're an average, everyday, working class woman. 16 hours of your day, on average, is spent going to and working a very menial job. And he wants to put you in that carriage so that you feel that, so that you wonder about that, so that the next time you see these people, instead of thinking, can't be bothered, you think, how could I change their lot in life? And that's realism.